Tonight on Insights on PBS Hawaii. Hawaii's high cost of living has placed nearly 17% of island residents below the poverty line. What measures are now before our state legislature that could provide some relief to low-income wage earners? Now, live in our studio, our host, Dan Boylan.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Dan Boylan. We have the highest cost of living in the nation. A family of four in Hawaii spends 61% more on food than a comparable family on the mainland. Housing prices are also the highest in the United States. 75% of families at or below the poverty line spend more than half of their incomes on housing. Add to those challenges that Hawaii is one of only 15 states that levies an income tax on families earning the minimum wage, and one of only 4 states that taxes those living below the poverty line. Tonight we'll explore proposed legislation to assist Hawaii's working poor. The bills being considered at the state legislature include raising the state minimum wage or tax credits. Will these measures provide significant relief and raise living standards of the working poor? Or will it have a negative impact on businesses still struggling in this uncertain economy? What about Hawaii's service workers? Will it affect our tourist industry? Joining us in the studio tonight are advocates for low-income wage earners, as well as a professor of economics and a member of the State Senate's Money Committee, who obviously couldn't be advocates for poor people. We also invite you to join the conversation. Sometimes we get ourselves mixed up here. Conversation by calling, emailing, or tweeting your questions and comments. Or you can join our live blog. The contact information you now see on your screen will be shown regularly throughout the program. Insights is also streaming live on your computer and will be posted on our website after the broadcast. Now to our panel. Victor Geminiani is the Executive Director of the Hawaii Appleseed Center for Law and Economic Justice, a nonprofit law firm that advocates on behalf of low-income families in Hawaii. Victor's extensive legal services career includes positions in Georgia, California, and Massachusetts. Sumner Croix is a professor of economics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and a UH Economic Research Organization Research Fellow. That's UHERO for short. His research focuses on the economic history, development, and current state of economies in the Asia-Pacific region. Since 1995, Jerry Rauckhorst has been president and CEO of Catholic Charities Hawaii. Established in 1947, Catholic Charities' mission is to assist those of all faiths and cultures, especially those in need. The nonprofit agency provides a variety of programs and services that assist the homeless, families, immigrants, seniors, and those with developmental disabilities. Jerry is a licensed social worker. State Senator Laura Thielen is a member of the Senate Ways and Means Committee. Before her election to the state Senate last November, Laura was the agricultural liaison for the city and county of Honolulu. She was also a member of Governor Linda Lingle's cabinet, serving as chair of the Department of Land and Natural Resources and is the former director of the State Planning Office. She is an attorney by trade, and her resume is just getting too long, Laura. We're going to have to shorten it next time.
Maybe I can hold a job.
Stay with that office for a while. Stay with the office for a while. Sumner LaCroix, the governor has called for it. There are bills still alive to raise the minimum wage in Hawaii, I believe, to what is it, $9.25? Is it? That is the eventual. Is that a good idea? Will that help the poor?
I think it's a very mixed idea. It's a mixed idea partly because there are better ways to help the poor. I think the earned income tax credit, which is another policy measure that's under consideration, and it's something that we don't have here in Hawaii and that other states have. I just think it's a far preferable tool. On the other hand, if we look at the minimum wage in Hawaii, it's far below in real terms where it used to be. When I was a kid bagging groceries, I earned $1.65 an hour. That's back in 1972. If we convert that into today's dollars, if we adjusted for inflation, it would be far above today's minimum wage. So we've seen a big decline in Hawaii's minimum wage in recent years. There's something to be said to raise the minimum wage, but just the reason why I'm somewhat tepid about it is I don't think it's a very effective anti-poverty tool.
What's to be said for it as an anti-poverty tool?
What's to be said for it as an anti-poverty tool is that some people who keep their jobs end up earning more. And those people who end up earning more, there are some good effects that come about from the extra earnings. There's more money in the family to go around for child care. It's really important that kids get appropriate care at early ages. We really know today that the child is the father of the future man or the mother of the future woman. That early care is really critical, and that extra small amount of money that can come in via the minimum wage can really be helpful. There's a variety of other things like that. But on the flip side, some people lose their jobs. And what we tend to find is
lose their jobs because
they lose their jobs because the wage is higher. And some firms find that it doesn't pay to keep the worker on. Some firms find that it pays to automate. If you go to Long's and you check out, you have a choice between checking out with a clerk who will check you out, or you can go to a machine. As we raise minimum wages, we're more likely to see more machines and fewer clerks.
Is the minimum wage, raising the minimum wage, do you get any sense of where the Money Committee and the Senate is on it?
Well, I think right now there's a couple budget proposals on the table. The governor had put one out, the House put theirs out, which had reduced the governor's budget some, and then the Senate issued a draft the other day. I think what's important to keep in mind in all three of these budget proposals, what they look at for the labor costs for the state is returning workers back to the level they were at before the 5% cuts that were imposed during the recession. But they do not include increases in the wages beyond that. So right now there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of budget items that are basically zeroed out. There's a line item for them, but we're not going to know what kind of money will be available until we have the contracts settled. And hopefully those are settled before the end of session, but it's a little up in the air. We do have these considerations in front of us. I think based on what Sumner said, you have poverty reduction. Is it appropriate to be taxing working people who are at poverty or below poverty? But I think you also are dealing with policy issues for what we call a gap group. People who are not in poverty, but they're working, and the income that they make is not enough to really support their families. And we call that, the shrinking middle class, and people are falling behind and not keeping up with the cost of living. So I think some of these tools that we have in front of us are dealing with different issues. I see the minimum wage as dealing more with that gap group and wages across the table, and things like the earned income tax credit trying to direct some type of relief to working people who are at or below poverty.
Victor, the minimum wage, you want it or not the biggest thing on your agenda?
This is a population that desperately needs some assistance. One thing you didn't mention when you were going through your introduction is not only do we have the highest cost of living and the highest cost of shelter and the highest tax rate for those that are low income, but we also pay the lowest wages in the state compared to any other state when you factor in cost of living. The need is great. And the costs are very expensive. So ultimately, I believe anything that we can possibly do to make more money, more finances available to the low-income population, the gap group, is valuable.
You said the lowest wages in the state, in the country?
In the nation.
In the nation?
In the nation. When
Hawaii
you factor in
does?
cost of living, we do. So we pay our workers less than anywhere else in the United States. As we said before, they have the highest cost of living and the highest tax rate. So I ultimately think all form of tax relief, all form of assistance to be able to get people that are living in the low income, the poverty population, and those in the gap group need some assistance.
But what if a small businessman's got seven people he's employing, and he's paying them now $7.25? Let's say he's paying the minimum wage, and is that right? Is it $7.25?
$7.25 now.
$7.25, and then we raise it on him to $9.25, or as I believe one of the bills is calling for it to even go according to inflation beyond that. What if he then says, okay, well, I'm going to let two people go, and is that good for the?
It's not good, and obviously I'm not necessarily suggesting that the minimum wage is the best tool we have. I personally think the poverty tax credit and most importantly the EITC, the earned income tax credit, are the most effective ways, as Sumner suggested, to get to the population that I am most concerned about. And those are people living in poverty, and that's a figure of $14,000 for one person, $17,000 for two people, $21,000 for three, and about $26,000 for four. Imagine raising a family in this state when you're paying 50% of your income on shelter. on $26,000 with a family of 4. Just try to imagine that. So that's the population.
Can't
I think
do it.
you can't do it. You fall into risk and you fall into the need for services that are quite expensive for the state to ultimately afford, and sometimes successful, sometimes not. It's better stop at the front end to get some people the dollars that they need ultimately to survive in this community. So I do not think that the minimum wage is something that should not be adopted. I do not think it should be adopted, however, in preference to the EITC or the poverty tax credit, which really gets to the population that's in crisis in our community.
Jerry, where are you in this?
You know, we just have so many individuals and families that are at great stress today. And I think anything we can do, you know, whether it's minimum wage or whether it's through the tax system, I think we've just got to take all measures that are possible. And again, you know, there are different groupings. And, you know, like Laura said, you know, with the GAP group, I do think, you know, the minimum wage increase makes a difference there. It may not make as much of a difference with, you know, the lower working poor, but, you know, with that GAP group, that's really a key area today. And especially, you know, because there really are so many families, you know, where there are 2 jobs, there are 3 jobs, in some cases there are even 4 jobs, and they're trying to make it. And something happens, and when they lose even one of those jobs out of 3 or 4, you know, it makes a huge difference. And I think that's where the minimum wage can really have an impact.
But if I'm not mistaken, we even have an argument, don't we, about what percentage is at the poverty line? The Census Bureau says 12%, but if you adjust it for cost of living, it's 17%.
Yes.
That's
229,000 people in this state.
how many?
229,000 people in the state.
We're 7th
It's a huge
highest in
number.
the nation.
Huge number.
Whoa. So, all right. You got your druthers. Someone explains to me the income tax credit. How does that work?
The EITC program was started by President Nixon, actually, as a major domestic program. It was implemented first by President Ford. Ronald Reagan increased it significantly. He felt it was the most valuable and effective poverty tool we had available. President Clinton made it his primary domestic tool to ultimately change the level of poverty in our country. What the EITC does is it acts as a wage supplement in areas where the wages are not particularly high. Hawaii is a classic example of that. And a employment incentive, because the more you work, the more you get. Bottom line is it takes people that are in the category of, we'll say, $13,000 to $26,000 and targets them depending upon the amount of people in their family, and gives them a credit, gives them an additional sum of money back from the federal government.
On their taxes, right?
Not only in their taxes.
Filed when you...
But it's also a positive refund to them. It's over and above what they paid in taxes. And the reason for that is it allows low-income families that are being paid, unfortunately, too low wages to ultimately survive in an appropriate fashion, funding from the government directly into their pockets when they file their 1040s. Most important issue is it bypasses government, and it bypasses the administration of services and the cost and the inefficiencies of government. It gets money directly into the pockets of low-income wage earners. It encourages them to work more, and it encourages them to ultimately believe more in the American dream, that if you work, it will pay. Work does and should pay in this country, so that if you're working 40 hours a week and you're working hard, you ought to be not living in poverty. And that's what the EITC is about. The state EITC program would replicate that federal EITC program, and it would give a percentage of whatever the federal EITC return is, could be 10%, 15%, 20%, back to the wage earners. 25 states in the United States, plus the District of Columbia, have implemented state EITC programs. We're getting to be the minority, and as we are in many of the figures we've talked about today, we're just falling farther and farther behind ideas that ultimately have proven effective and efficient to help this population.
And it's really useful to note that already people in the state of Hawaii can claim the earned income credit from the federal government.
Yes.
Okay, so it'd be easy for the state to implement an earned income credit. All they'd have to say is take the amount of the earned income credit that you're getting from the federal government, multiply it by a certain percentage, and that's your Hawaii earned income credit. It's one line, one very simple approach. It doesn't have to be full of bureaucracy. It can all be tied essentially to what the feds do. If we think it's a little too expensive, we lower it slightly. If we want to be a little bit more generous, we raise the percentage slightly. But this is a very easy program to implement. That said, the federal program, which of course we're all part of already, is way too bureaucratic, has lots of rules. It's somewhat complex. It's hard to understand. I read through many of the rules today. I was perplexed by many of them. But again, tax preparation programs, simple ones, like TurboTax, or the H&R Block stuff, you go through a menu of questions, you fill them out. It's not that onerous, and out comes a number. It's something that we could easily enact. It does cost us money. I mean, this is essentially a subsidy. This is a subsidy of the state to people who are poor and working. And the subsidy increases with the number of children that they have. So if you have a dependent children, you get a bigger subsidy to work than if you don't. If you have a second, you get an even bigger subsidy. If you have a third, you get a larger subsidy. Usually cuts off at 3 children.
Lowell Kalapa, the Tax Foundation, calls this backdoor welfare, and he's utterly opposed to it. He says it's just another welfare program, but you're calling it something nicer, the Earned Income Tax Credit. But that's just what you said. It's a subsidy. It's going to cost the state money. And as a person who's sitting on that finance committee, well, how much money can the state dole out? I mean, I believe there was a candidate for president this year who talked about 47%, the 47% that are takers. You want to help those takers?
Well, I think, again, the budget is a policy decision by the state, and we're going to be expending money on certain things. When it comes down to help for low-income, indigent people, we could do it through programs, we do it through services. There's a question of, do we want to also do it through an earned income tax credit? Lowell calls it a welfare program, but it really is targeting working people. And it's a recognition that there are wages that people work at that do not, they're living below poverty even though they're working full-time. Somebody working full-time at minimum wage, who has a child, or 2 people, they're living in poverty. And so you're trying to rectify that situation. The tool of saying we're going to raise the minimum wage puts the burden on the employer and says, okay, let's have the employer pay the cost of rectifying the situation. The Earned Income Tax Credit puts the burden on the state in that it forgoes certain tax revenues and refunds them plus an additional subsidy to the worker. Again, to me, the question partly is who's going to bear the cost, but really what are these tools going to do? And I think Hawaii's got an interesting economy where most of our employers are service-oriented. That's why our wages are lower than in other places in the United States, but our cost of living is a lot higher. So I think, to me, the minimum wage is something where you have to be careful because you don't want to hurt the businesses. You don't want to get to the point where they're laying people off. But at the same time, if our wages are depressed, you do need to address that gap group. You do need to address working people, and to help people be able to afford the housing and the cost of living here. I think when we make those choices on the budget on helping people in poverty, I like the Earned Income Tax Credit because it is helping people who are out there working in the lowest wage paying jobs, and we need those people. We need them desperately.
We also need them to feel that the American dream can be fulfilled by themselves and their children. There's something about people working 40 hours and still struggling in poverty to survive when you have 3 or 4 children that ultimately depend upon you. There's something about the belief that the values of this country and the promises of this country, in fact, can work in your favor as long as you do what you're supposed to be doing, and at least what you've been told when you're growing up as a kid. The system is fair, you work hard, you will succeed. That's not true. We wish it was, but it's not. So, and sometimes there have to be some adjustments to make sure that the families live in a way that ultimately we all could be proud of, but most importantly, that they continue to feel that the American dream is alive for them and their children.
Again, I just want to emphasize that there is incentive involved with Earned Income Tax Credit, and I think that makes a huge difference. And, for the folks that are going to receive the Earned Income Tax Credit, I mean, they see that as a result of what they've done.
You don't get it if you don't work.
You have to work.
It's not a direct handout.
Right. And the other point that I want to make is, we were talking about the subsidy. So yeah, the state would have to subsidize. But on the other hand, for those who fall deeper into poverty, who rely even more on state and state kind of programs, there's a cost. So the reality is, whether the cost is through the subsidy for Earned Income Tax Credit, or whether it's the programs that these families are going to likely need, or the subsidies, the other types of subsidies they're going to need, again, the cost is going to be there. So it's much better to give the incentive. It's a hand up. It's not a handout. And I think that's something that's really very, very important with Earned Income Tax Credit.
I also say that this is a program that has been supported by President Nixon, President Reagan, President Reagan called it the best domestic program we had because it bypassed government, didn't worry about the services that had to be provided, but targeted the people that needed the money the most. Very efficient, as Sumner would say, very efficient distribution process, not complex at all. So this has been a championed by conservatives over and over again. As I say to my friend Local Lapa.
This is the largest safety net program that we have in the United States, and Hawaii just chooses not to participate. I mean, again, we do participate at the federal level, but we do not have a state program.
Let me give you the size.
There's 26 other states that also don't have. The program.
Sumner, look, I'm not an economist. They'd never let me work at UHERO. I don't understand this money stuff, but you know, I do sit here every week or so, and all you hear are people who need money, programs that need money, social service programs that need subsidies, state subsidies. The state's got to pay money, and if anything, over the last 5 or 6 years, we've been in pretty rough times. And the guys down at the legislature, she wasn't at the legislature. She was in an executive job during some of that period. I mean, she knew. She of course knew. I mean, the money was tough down there. So now you want to add another program that is a subsidy.
But it's an easy program, too. We're not adding a big bureaucracy. Okay, this is a program that's administered via the tax form. All right, so there's no big bureaucracy being added. I think Local Apa's characterization of this as just another kind of welfare is just wrong. If you're not working, you don't get any payments under EIC. This is a wage subsidy to people who work. If you only work a little bit, you only get a very small subsidy. If you work more, you get a bigger subsidy. Now, what are the results on people participating in this program? It turns out that people who receive these subsidies, they don't really work more or less, but it draws more people who are doing very poorly into the workforce.
I mean, if anything,
it leads to a bigger workforce, and we have some people who otherwise might be on welfare or otherwise might be really destitute and be coming to some of the social service agencies looking for help, who instead are out there working and actually making a living. It does cost something to the state. It's not a costless program. It's something that the state has to put up bucks for, and any program the state has to put up bucks for, the state has to ask itself either where's it going to spend less or where's it going to tax more. I mean, it clearly is something that those types of implications would have to be thought through. But you look at some of the other implications of this program. For example, a great study of the earned income credit shows that families that get the earned income credit, the test scores of kids in the families rise by very significant amounts. Okay. Well, here in this state, we worry about poor families and the academic performance in the poor families. EIC is one way without worrying about all of the stuff that goes on with the teachers' unions, the Board of Education, the parents, and the kids, and everything else in the state. It's a simple way of raising test scores. When these families have a little bit more income, they have a little bit more time and a little bit more resources to spend with the kids, and test scores rise. That's a great result, and we ought to be looking at those results when we look at programs like the earned income credit.
Since low-income people don't have savings accounts, they can't afford to have savings accounts, this money is churned back right through the economy. And studies have indicated that it returns $1.67 or better for every dollar that's spent. So it's not a total loss in terms of a drain from the state. The state does get economic vitality through the spending of the dollars, because the dollars are spent as soon as they get them.
I just wanted to mention that today I had an opportunity to talk to one of our staff people, and she was talking about one of the clients that, is a beneficiary on the federal level, of the earned income tax credit. And basically, the monthly revenues are around $2,800. The expenses, which would include primarily the housing, the transportation, the food, and this is a single lady with one child. So it's $2,700. So that leaves $100 a month over and above the primary expenses. Now, if the state were able to come through with this subsidy, for earned income tax credit, it would be another $650 that she would receive. Now, that would make a huge difference in terms of any kind of crisis. For instance, if the car, needs a major repair, if there's some sickness with her child, it just makes a huge difference in terms of whether that person is going to be able to make it or not. So we think, $600 sometimes doesn't seem like a lot of money, but for people who are in these situations, and again, working very hard, to raise their family, it makes a huge difference.
Hawaii, I'm sorry.
I just want to make one point about this subsidy issue. This program is as much a subsidy for employers as it is for the employees, because it's recognizing that the minimum wage is that people are living in poverty when they're being paid the minimum wage. So it allows people to get some extra compensation, even though they're at that low wage. It allows employers to hire more people at those low wages. So when they talk about subsidies, a lot of times they're focusing on the person, in poverty, as though it's their fault and they should be able to pull themselves up on their bootstraps. This subsidizes employers and businesses.
A question from David in Wailuku. What percentage of people in Hawaii earn the minimum wage? I don't know. What is it?
There's 15,000 people that are currently working at minimum wage salaries. Between $7.25 where it currently is up to about $9.25 where it may be, there's another 45,000. So there's about 65,000 totally below $9.25.
And nationwide, when you talk about between $7.25 and $9.25, you're talking about between 5 and 10% of the working population.
If we've got some cash into the wallets of working folk, that money will trickle up to business and business owners and will generate tax dollars in the process. Let's raise wages. That's the other side of raising the minimum wage. There'll be more money in the economy. People will have more money to spend, right?
But also with the ITC.
Well, that's right.
Same thing.
Same thing.
This has to be financed. This isn't one of these things where we just run a government deficit to do it, or we issue state bonds. I mean, really, there needs to be some type of tax to actually fund the program, or some type of spending cut. I mean, it's not completely clear to me that argument really holds that much water. I think the most critical thing here is we're really talking about people at the bottom 5% of the income level, and we're really saying we need to find some way to help them. If we really don't believe that they need help, then there's no reason to have the discussion here. I mean, part of the problem is what's the most effective policy tool? And the problem with the minimum wage is that it taxes work. This actually is a subsidy to work, but its downside is that it does cost the government money. I mean, the government does, there is less of a tax refund that comes in. There's less tax payments to come from these families at the lower 5%. It's a little bit shocking that we're talking about tax payments.
I know.
That we're talking about income tax payments from families in the lower 5%.
Well, let's talk about that other law then for the moment. The poverty
tax credit.
The poverty tax credit.
Very simple. It's a law that's used by 10 other states to eliminate the taxation on poor people. If you're in poverty, you pay no taxes, and the poverty tax credit would fill up the cup. If you owed $500, it would fill up the cup with $500. If you owed $200, it'd fill up the cup with that. So bottom line is it takes people where they are, takes a look at their adjusted gross income. If it's below the poverty line, they pay no taxes. If it's between 100 and 125% of the poverty line, they pay half the taxes they normally would. It's a way to reverse the record we have of being the worst tax state in the United States and starting to reduce taxes and eliminate taxes on those in poverty. It makes no policy sense at all to tax people deeper into poverty. I mean, there's no justification for that. From an economic, from a equitable fairness perspective, economic perspective, bad policy. So bottom line is the poverty tax credit would create a program which would eliminate the tax on people that are living in poverty, whatever that tax might be.
So, for example, the marginal tax rates for a single person in poverty or a couple in poverty, 6.8% of their income tax is the rate. So if you're earning, full-time minimum wage job, you're earning about $15,000 a year, working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks, no vacation, you're going to be taxed on that $15,000. Your income tax in Hawaii will be over $1,000. So that's what we're talking about on the poverty tax, is to eliminate that tax on people in poverty.
Well, it doesn't make sense but why is our tax system so regressive? I remember years ago that people would tell me, business folks would tell me the Hawaii income tax, it's one of the most progressive taxes. But that's not what the figures show, right?
We throw in GET. The problem is we support half our government with GET. It's an efficient, effective way of getting a lot of money in to feed the government, take care of the needs.
Well, yeah, but if I've heard folks from your organization, I don't think that it was actually called that organization then, argue that this was a wonderful tax, that because it hits everybody and it hits them wherever they move. Anything that moves gets taxed, but it is a regressive tax, right?
The GET is a regressive tax. It's an efficient tax because it's very difficult to avoid, because we're taxing both services and products. Right. We don't find people saying, here's a way to avoid the tax. I'll reclassify my products in this way. Or I'll only start selling products that have the very low tax rate. The 4% tax does not look that high compared to some of the other sales taxes that you see in other places, although it does apply to both goods and services. If we were going to be financing the EIC, I would certainly be in favor of us raising the GET by a small amount, say from 4 to 4.5%, and then refunding part of that GET back to people earning less than a certain income amount. But that's something that we really ought to be thinking about. We really ought to be thinking about, if we believe that tax is too regressive, of refunding parts of it to people earning less than a certain amount of money.
Any finance committee, you guys are working the rails down there at the Capitol. Is anybody on any finance committee talking about raising a tax, the GE tax or any other tax? Why not if we want to do these things?
I think nobody's been talking about a comprehensive tax reform to make the Hawaii tax code more progressive. Usually, anytime anybody floats the GE, increase, it's for a specific project or a specific purpose. And my personal opinion is the general population doesn't support it because they don't have faith that government's going to meet the proposed purpose. I think it would be another issue to say, should we go back and take a comprehensive look at our tax code to make it more progressive? And that's something I would support, but I think that would take a fairly large effort to look at.
But how do we ever convince folks that we have to that it would serve the proper purpose? Because really everybody's got a purpose, and in fact there are purposes. And what is one person's purpose is not a.
I didn't mean that it's not serving the proper purpose. I think people have lost faith that government can deliver the services that it says it can deliver. And so it's just a matter of when you say to people, let's raise the GET because we're going to be putting it into education and public education. Well, people support public education, but they're not convinced that we're going to be able to improve it. And so I think we have to, this is for another topic, but I think we have to bring faith back into government that we can deliver the end product that we're supposed to. And then people might be willing to look at it. But if we were to go back to our tax code and say our tax code is very regressive, we're one of the most expensive states in the nation to live in, and we are making it harder on people at the lowest economic level and the gap group people, is there a way we should restructure it to make it so that it's fairer and people can live the American dream, as Victor talks about, that they can be rewarded for working?
Well, Susan in St. Louis Heights says, Hawaii was once a very progressive supportive of the underprivileged. What has changed? And you would indicate that it's because people have lost faith in government doing the right thing with.
No, I think that's a different question.
I can tell you what I think it is. We, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, had a group of people in positions of influence and power in the state that had friends and aunties and uncles that grew up in poverty on plantations. So poverty and unfairness and discrimination was live in everyone's life. As people have become more affluent and a group has fallen behind, there are less people that feel in their hearts and minds that group needs attention. We don't take care of our poor the way we used to in this state. We've lost that progressive feeling, and I ultimately think we're weaker for it as a people. I think we all know that we don't treat people fairly in this state. The fact that you have people at the bottom end of the scale, economic scale, paying twice what people at the top end of the scale are paying in income taxes or in general taxes. It doesn't make any sense. It's just an unequitable system. So I ultimately think we have to go back and rediscover why we were a progressive state and the benefits we achieved because we were a progressive state and start to capture that imagination.
Jerry, do you see this in the people that you serve? I mean, are they?
Absolutely. Definitely we see it in the people we serve, because they feel that they're basically just left out, and they see that, what's happening around them. People do have opportunities, people can get ahead, but for some reason, they're just caught sort of in this circumstance and in this situation, and they don't see a whole lot of way out. there's very little hope and a lot of despair, as a result of that. And I think, we really have to be able to turn that around. And
the institutions are failing our poor people.
They are.
The educational system is broken in terms of providing really the education that most people would hope for their children. The judicial system, for all intents and purposes, is closed to those that don't have funding. You may get a little help, pro se assistance, whatever, but not direct representation in most situations. The political system is, for all intents and purposes, closed to them. They don't have access. They're working when lobbyists with special interests are down there pushing whatever position they want. It's an intimidating process to go through. So ultimately, the institutions that I think are there to protect and nurture this group of people that so desperately needs it just are not resolving the types of issues that they've got to resolve to provide the opportunity people need.
Sat here, ex-Governor Cayetano sat here a couple of weeks ago and said to a former legislator, whenever people who are on the margins of society are down and there's a squeeze in the state, they always lose. They always lose. And maybe it's the history. Maybe you got a point, Victor.
I think there's two other things going on too. One is that we are putting a lot more money into Medicaid, the program which provides health care to people who are relatively poor. And I think that is squeezing out resources for other types of assistance to poor people. But there's another point too, and that is, that this state has had very little economic growth on average since 1990. We really have had 2 decades where, if you go over the full decades, again, there's been some periods that have been poor there, some periods been better, but you take those full two decades, the 23 years since 1990, and economic growth is less than 0.2% per year. It's almost nothing. And when you're in an environment where your average person is finding, I'm not getting ahead, I'm not getting the growth I was before, I don't think people are as willing to be as generous. They're not looking ahead saying, okay, I can give some now because I know I'm going to be earning more later.
We are spending a lot more than we used to. I went back and looked at Governor Burns's budget in 1967, and even accounting for inflation, our operational budget is 4 times bigger today than it was back then. A lot of it, though, is going to these non-discretionary costs, the debt service, the Medicare, the Medicaid, and government's a lot bigger, and there's a lot more special interest groups out there advocating. But Health and Human Services is the biggest portion of our budget now. It's now in combination surpassing public education. Public education comes next. So there's services there, but I think the choices that we make about which services, how to fund them, and how to generate the revenues, has resulted in a situation where our revenues are very regressive.
We live on an island. Everything has to be shipped here, building material, oil. If we got free shipping, things would be cheaper. Anytime an employee gets a pay raise at a store, then price of their products go up. If minimum wage went up, then so would taxes. The more you make, the more you need to spend. Michael in Kahului. I guess that's a comment more than anything else. From Cover It Live. Well, the rich and powerful never learn. When they deny workers a decent wage, then regular folk will get together and turn to government for help. The rich must wield their power responsibly, or they risk losing it. Do our employers not?
Most people work for small businesses,
Yeah.
so I think this, mentality that this rich and powerful hoarding all the money in Hawaii, it's a tough economy. It's a tough economy for small businesses. It's a tough economy to build a diversified economy, and we don't have much outside the service sector, as you know. So it's hard. I don't think it should be an us against them mentality. We're in this together.
What about that problem of our being such a service sector economy? I mean, that means that a minimum wage has an out of proportion impact, doesn't it?
Well, on some things it doesn't really matter. So, for example, if after this show I decide to go out for fast food, okay, if the minimum wage is a little bit higher and the price of the meal is $6.10 versus $6, I'm probably still going to get it. I'd be hungry. I'm going to get it. We're not going to find that big of an effect there. On the other hand, if what we have is we have a minimum wage worker who's making a coffee cup, made in Hawaii, hopefully made in Hawaii here, but they're making a coffee cup that's made in Hawaii, and they're competing with the worker in China, then an increase in the minimum wage may well make that business less viable here in Hawaii. So, it is interesting too. There's some types of businesses, such as fast foods, where I don't think the minimum wage makes that much of a difference. But there's others, particularly in export competing industries, where all of a sudden it can take away that margin of profit and make the industry less viable.
Cheryl wants to know, I thought we had a self-regulating economic system. How did we get to the point that people working full-time are living at poverty level? Yeah, you guys teach that stuff, that, you know, that self-regulating economy, it all works out. How did this come to be? Guys working 40 hours, working hard, wife's working 40 hours, can't afford housing?
There are two ways to look at poverty, okay? One way to look at poverty is that we have a lot of people who don't have the right skills to succeed in the society. Okay, there's a lot of reasons why they don't have the right skills. Some people had bad luck. Some people had illness. Some people didn't get the right skills in school. We've emphasized a lot of that. I think the state actually is doing a lot to try to improve the school system. But we have a lot of people who are not particularly skilled. And people who are not particularly skilled and have had some bad luck end up out there not doing real well in the labor market. I think that's a real reason. If we had a better school system, both private and public, no reason to necessarily pick on just the public, but if we had a better school system, we were giving kids better skills, we wouldn't find as much poverty, period. So, I mean, there's two ways to look at poverty. One is how to alleviate it. What are the basic factors that we can adjust where in the future we're going to have less poverty versus we're talking more about poverty alleviation. We're really talking about what about the people now who are really having a tough time with it?
Why are workers' wages considered costs that must be minimized, yet we are constantly raising executive salaries, example, UH officials, to attract the best and brightest? Isn't that a double standard? I mean, again, it's the distance between rich and... I can't tell you the number of people who've given, because I represent to them somebody who worked for the university, who've looked at that librarian salary, the new librarian salary. $195,000. What are you paying $195,000 to a librarian for? I mean, you know, they just stamp books, right? Well, that's not, of course, they do a lot more than that. But there is this wages for people in executive positions in government, in private sector. Nothing seems to have changed there. How do we do it? How do we deal with that? I mean, these folks keep going up, these folks just keep getting hit.
It's really a separate issue. I mean, you know, if you wanted to defend it, you would say that we're paying the national wages that are required to get a good librarian to come to Hawaii. There's certainly other areas, if we want to look at banker salaries, I really don't think that they are very defensible. And that we often our executive salaries, I think, really are a bit out of control, and that we need a little bit better corporate governance institutions to try to keep them in better control. I'm not sure that necessarily has that much effect directly, though, on how much we're paying, people who are at the lower end of the wage spectrum. But it certainly provides a tremendous contrast, and I think it also adds a certain political dimension to it all, where people at the lower end ask, how can this be? And I think that's a very legitimate, reasonable question,
yeah.
And it does lead to discord. It leads to discord in the society.
Yeah.
It's a big national issue, just the shrinking middle class, more people going down into that gap group and that lower wage group, and then the disparity, the wages of the upper 1% and 5% have gone up so high that it's even depressed people that are in the top 5 to 10% period from where they would be where we were in 1970. So there's just been a huge income disparity in the United States. I haven't seen what it is for Hawaii. And I don't know what the policy answers are for that, but it just seems nationally.
I'll tell you on millionaires, not to soak the rich, but there's an equity issue involved here. And we don't want to raise taxes, but ultimately we need money to be able to support the services that we need to get out of the hole we've created. We have the second highest number of millionaires in Hawaii and any other state. Maryland's the only other state that exceeds that. In the last 3 years, that number has grown by 18.6%. So the numbers of people at the very top are growing significantly. In 10 years, between 2001 and 2011, I believe, the low-income wage earners have had an increase in salary of about 10%. So the inequality continues to grow. As Laura said, for the last 20 years nationally, we've had a growth of inequality. That's what the movement in Wall Street was all about. And we've heard all about the one percenters. But the bottom line is people have got to return to some sense of equity in terms of distribution of resources. And to be frank with you, the people that have a lot of money have made a lot more money than anyone else. And the fact of the matter is they control the payroll. So they can decide who exactly is going to be rewarded and who's not. Some of it goes to Sumner's position in terms of the training and the skills that they have. They sell their services the highest amount they possibly can, and I think that's great. It's the American dream. It's how the system works. But some sense of equity in terms of distribution, who's carrying the cost and who's benefiting from the investments we have in this country and the skills we have in this country? Those are the questions that have to be asked.
I thought you were going to say something.
The only thing I wanted to add is, again, I think it comes down to the cost of living. And when the cost of living is at a certain level, and when you have so many people that cannot meet that standard, that's where this disparity has even more impact. Because that's where, people really do fall into despair, and they just can't understand it, How can people be paid at this level when I'm at this level and I can't buy food, or I can't make the payment, or I'm going to lose my house. Those types of things are real issues.
Tim and Hanalei asked that question. We've talked about other ways of helping the poor, but this one's been around a long time. Have we looked at how seriously have we looked at waiving the GET on food? I mean, the first thing that a person needs is food.
Absolutely.
But the Republicans have long talked about that. That's part of their agenda. But we've never. Is it because if we did, we would lose so much income
I
for the
haven't
state
seen
revenue?
what the foregone revenue would be if you waive GET on food, but I think the GET again is, as Sumner was saying, is a very broad-based tax, and then we also have a certain percentage that are being paid by tourists. And so if you waive it for food across the board, it's going to be foregoing a lot of revenue from folks that maybe it's not hurting to have to pay the GET on that. So I think it's a matter of trying to target, if you want, who are you trying to help? If you're trying to help people in poverty, you may adopt a certain set of policy regulations like an earned income tax credit. If you're trying to address, middle class to try and help bring that back, you may address, a certain other type of tax, minimum wage or other things like that. And I do want to point out also for Hawaii, a lot of our businesses are small businesses. These people are hurting as well. It's what we're seeing is you used to have kind of an income distribution like this. Now what you're seeing is something that's low and then it jumps up. And so you've got your small business owners that they're in depressed revenues as well, and they're struggling too. Yeah. And they're subject to a very high tax rate, a high marginal tax rate when they're not earning, that much themselves. They're not in that upper income bracket, they're in the middle income bracket. So these are tough policy calls.
The other alternative is to do a tax credit, which we have. We have an $85 tax credit that goes to low income to refund some of the dollars that they have spent on food and GET, other types of services. But so it's a refundable tax credit, which is very critical. We could expand the ability to have refundable tax credits for a targeted population. Those at the bottom level. Unfortunately, the bill that's coming through the Senate and the House on the poverty tax credit eliminates the food credit, refundability of the food credit. So it's going to be actually a tax on a tax those that are in the lowest economic levels of our state even further. I'm hoping that through the conference committees that refundability will be in fact restored.
Mel downtown asked a good question. Why have our elected officials, both city and state, not proposed rent control? Why don't we have rent control? I mean, in a place where affordable housing or renting an apartment or a room is so high, why don't we have rent control? What are the economics on rent control? Not a good idea?
Rent control is a disaster.
Oh, boy. There we go.
Rent control is a disaster.
Sorry, Mel. Sumner says rent control is a disaster.
The number one thing that rent control does is it increases at the lower rents, which you see the rent control set at. It increases the demand for housing. It also reduces the supply. You find a lot more people when the rents are lower. All of a sudden, the room above their garage becomes a storage area for their lawnmowers. All of a sudden, the extra room becomes a sewing room. All of a sudden, the extra room becomes a billiards room. People start to use the room for their own space. And what we start to find is that lots of rooms for students and lots of rooms for low-income poor people just start to dry up. The housing supply dries up. Rent control is not the way to do it. We have endless examples of cities that have really ruined themselves with rent control.
Name three.
Well, Berkeley's one. Berkeley is certainly one that has had tremendous problems with rent control and has gone back and forth with its legislation over time. St. Louis is another. There's a city, too, that with a combination of public housing and rent control has just had an absolute disaster with its downtown urban. San Francisco is another city where, because of rent control, what you tend to find is that relatively rich people tend to stay in their rent-controlled apartments. They get in rent-controlled apartments and they stay in there forever. even when they no longer need the extra space,
right,
even when the rent is higher.
You came
Sorry,
up with three.
I've gone on way too long.
You did it, Sumner.
I have one suggestion, though, on how to control rental prices in Hawaii is stop the illegal vacation rentals in residential neighborhoods.
Well, you have it in Kailua, don't you?
Well, you have it in Kailua, you have it in Hawaii Kai, you have it in Waimanalo. All three of those are in my districts. I'm sure you have it in Haleiwa, in the North Shore. You can get a lot more money from a 1-week rental, and you rent them out for 4 weeks out of the month, and it just raises the real estate prices there for the home buyers as well as for the
What
renters.
about the military subsidies for
Military subsidies are also very
station?
tough. My old neighborhood where we lived, people just have moved out of it because all the officers move in there. They get $2,000 a month in a subsidy, and changes the rental prices.
What is the income level that puts you in the poverty bracket? This is both a question and a comment. Even if you make $50,000 in Hawaii, you are still realistically in the poverty range.
Not under the federal guidelines. Federal guidelines are established and they're raised every year depending upon the cost of living. In this state, it's $14,000. Actually, I have the exact figures here. It's $12,860 for one person. It's $17,410 for two people. $21,960, call it $22,000 for three, and $26,510 for four. Every person after that goes up about $4,000. Those are officially set.
So you're talking between maybe $2,000 plus per month to about $1,000 per month for these people.
That still sounds like poverty to me.
That is
Hawaii.
poverty.
It is.
That
That's
is
the
poverty.
level.
There's just no other.
I mean,
But
it's
for
all
a family of four, I mean, you could have $3,000 a month, you're above poverty, and you are still going to be struggling.
Absolutely.
So that's, again, that gap group, it's hurting across the board.
Have people in the finance committee, or have you heard from the governor's people, have they, this isn't the way to say it, this is the wrong verb, costed out? Is that what they say? Costed out? What the poverty tax, eliminated, and the earned income tax credit, if you took the two of those, how much would the state revenue would be lost? Do they know?
The Department of Taxation does revenue projections and what the estimated loss of revenue would be. We haven't put a percentage figure on the earned income tax credit. It would be, in a range of a certain percentage of the federal earned income tax credit. I think they came up with an estimate that if it was 20%, it would be about, 47 million?
There's, believe it or not, coming into the federal government, getting back to what Summer was saying, coming in from the federal government every year, there's $239 million flooding into Hawaii. So at a 10% EITC rate, it would be $23 million for the state. At a 20%, it would be 46. The poverty credit is around $19 million.
So that would come out of the state budget?
Yes.
It would be lost revenue.
Lost revenue, $19 million.
For the poverty tax credit for the EITC at 10%, it's $23 million. At 20%, it's $46 million.
Have you totaled that up for me? What does that come to?
Well, at $23 million plus 19 is 42, I think, if I did it correctly. 42 million at 46, which is a 20%. It would be 19 plus 26, 46, $65 million.
Yeah.
Now, and can we afford that?
Budget's all choices. So you have a certain amount of revenue and a certain amount of expenditures, and so if you forego the revenue for this purpose, then it's going to have to come at the expense of other expenditures. And the matter is, yes, we can afford many of these choices, but we cannot afford all the things that we would like to do.
I do think, however, within this category that we're talking about tonight, a contribution by the business community through the adoption of a minimum wage that's realistic is at the same time a contribution by the taxpayers for the general revenues for the EITC or top poverty tax credit starts to put money on a very focused way on the group we're talking about. So I personally think that a private-public partnership between both of us, business and taxpayers, makes sense to ultimately make an impact on this population.
A comment, if housing was more affordable, people could live on lower incomes a lot better. And we've had other programs on this, but isn't that a fundamental problem? And do you see anybody addressing it in government or the private sector? No.
It's just, the commitment to try to, increase the rental housing trust fund, which is going to increase the number of affordable units that are out there. But other than that, and so many of the affordable units aren't really even affordable. you know, again, for the population that we're talking about.
When they talk about affordability in Kaka'ako, for example, they're talking about 80% of AMI, 59,000 for one person, about 89,000 for a family of four. That's not poverty. It may be struggling, family may be struggling, but that affordability is a joke. We have now about 19,000 units we need for the population we're talking about, and we're producing around 300 to 500 a year. I do think that there are a lot of potential answers out there if we reconceptualize how we're going to build buildings and what kind of buildings we actually have to have for the population we have in this state. I think we can reduce costs significantly and create real affordable housing. It's obviously quite complicated, from NIMBYism to political will, to the designs that would be acceptable, to the permitting process and the waivers that would be necessary to bring the cost down, to the land acquisition and utilization. All of those issues are barriers, but they're all overcomable.
And more. I want you to predict on this vast experience you've had in 2 months at the legislature.
I think it's 2.5 months, please.
Is the earned income tax credit and the poverty tax law, are they going to pass?
I can't predict that.
Oh, come on.
I'm a freshman in the Senate. I'm only one of many people on the Ways and Means Committee on the Senate side, plus you have the House side. It is making its way through the legislature. It is still in play.
I've never been in the legislature, and I'm always predicting things, and we're out of time. Thank you all very, very much. We really appreciate it. It's a difficult subject, and I hope both make it through. Next week on Insights, we'll look at another critical issue working its way through the legislature. Hawaii's goal of reducing our reliance on imported oil depends on our access to sun, wind, and waves. But how do we find the equipment needed to harness these natural resources? There is a proposed financing plan to help cover these startup costs, and it could put Hawaii on the green energy map. That's next time on Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Dan Boylan. A hui ho.